It's Ratnabandhu, and I'm speaking to Satyadhana.
Hello.
Hi, Satyadhana.
Hi there.
Hi. So this is the second interview that I'm doing with him, where I'm asking him to explain and expand on a recent article that he wrote last December called Understanding Praticca Samupada. The way that we decided to divvy the interviews up was to take a section or two from the article and just expand on it, because the article, as you say, is quite dense, and it'd be a shame just to gloss over the whole thing. So we decided, okay, let's just focus in on particular aspects. So last week we were focusing on the 3 lakshanas, and this week we're going to focus in on Pratītya-Samutpāda, the core of your article. The article is called Understanding Praticca Samupada. So we'll go into that in some depth. And then we'll just let the whole thing organically unfold. So 3 sections. First, I'm going to review the last interview with a series of questions, because when I re-listened to it, a number of questions came up for me, and they might have come up for you if you've listened to interview 1. So I'll ask him about those. And then in the second section, as I said, I'll ask him to talk about Pratītya-Samutpāda, and then we let the conversation unfold. Okay, so let me get my questions up here. So when you were talking about the path or understanding the 3 lakshanas the last time, I was curious about a translation that you made, or a suggestion that you made, to translate anicca, or impermanence, as unsustainability. Could you explain why you chose to translate that in that way? Like, is there a canonical precedent for that, or is it from your own experience?
It's mostly from my own experience. Obviously, in the Pali Canon, all you have is anicca. There's generally not a whole lot of context that's provided there. The reason I think unsustainable can be a good choice is that it highlights the fact that what you're looking for isn't available. So if you're looking for sustainability for things to stay the way you want them to be, that's not going to be the case. What I've personally experienced with translating that as impermanence is that the tendency is to assume that there's an inherent quality called impermanence that actually does apply to everything. In that regard, it might be better to translate it as non-permanence, which to me also is less susceptible to being applied as a universal quality of everything you see. It's just that there's no permanence available. So that's why I suggested something like unsustainable, or again, maybe non-permanence.
Okay, it sort of seems more akin to what's real somehow in your experience.
Yeah.
Unsustainable. Okay, can you bring us through the 3 lakshanas again, and why you describe them as not characteristics of reality, but more correctives for an orientation or an understanding of reality that we carry with us as a belief system?
Sure. So the first is anicca, non-permanence. So we look for permanence, and as if we need a reminder, we rarely, if ever, find it. And actually, we don't find it. Nothing is ever going to stay the same. What happens, though, is that eventually you don't perceive that things change any longer either. You lose the sense of things rising and falling in time and space being mental constructs that you can superimpose onto experience, but you don't have to. So eventually neither permanence nor non-permanence is seen to apply. It just doesn't make any sense, or it doesn't resonate any longer. So initially you can remind yourself that there's no such thing as permanence until you stop expecting to find it. And then you don't need that as a reminder.
Okay, can I slow you down a little bit, please?
Yeah.
So are you saying that, say, when you read about or hear about the lakshanas, the first lakshana being impermanence, that is not describing reality?
Not the experience of reality. Obviously, you can look around and at a conventional level, things are changing. But as far as impermanence being an inherent quality that seems to explain what's happening, that falls away.
Okay. So impermanence is a corrective to a belief system that presumes permanence. So say you see that there is no permanence, is pretty obvious. So are you saying that then there's a sort of a tendency of the intellect or the mind to go, oh, things are not permanent, therefore they must be impermanent.
Right.
That's a corrective bit, yeah?
Right. It's like you want to hang your hat on something, and if I can't have permanence, well, I'll take impermanence, because at least that's something to know, to try and predict what's happening and so forth.
Okay. So if you discover that Santa Claus does not exist, the mental tendency is to go, Santa Claus does not exist, therefore non-Santa Claus must exist.
Yeah, or non-Santa Claus must describe what's happening here.
Yeah, right, okay. All right, so I hope people have got that point. It feels quite subtle to me in some respects. I mean, actually, it's quite obvious in other respects. But I get how there's actually spiritual work in there to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not necessarily that you learn that there's no such thing as permanence. You accept it. You stop trying to ignore it or fight it or resist it. There's just no such thing as permanence.
Yeah. I think you used an interesting word there, Satyadhana, like learn. I think the learning process for this sort of material isn't a sort of like read and remember thing. For me, the process was one of reading it once, then again. So it was more like a familiarity. So I just became familiar with this way of understanding my experience.
Yeah, and then ultimately it's a matter of experiencing that. And then you can look back and go, oh yeah, there's just no such thing as permanence, and that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. So another thing that you mentioned in the article, in the Lakshana section, which I don't think we talked about the last time, which would be a shame to miss, asking you to talk about it, is you said that of the three Lakshanas, insubstantiality is the only one that survives in terms of a description that actually does describe reality. Can you talk about that or expand on that some for me, please?
Right. Actually, there's the second Lakshana, which we didn't cover, of dukkha, which also fades away. It might be helpful just to go over that
yes,
really
okay,
quickly
let's go
first.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you don't expect that things will always go a certain way or go well, then you won't have the experience of things not going well either. That may be a little clearer than, if you don't look for permanence, you won't find non-permanence. In the case of the second lakshana, if you don't have unrealistic expectations about how you're going to feel or what's going to happen, you won't experience what is happening as not going well, which is basically a literal translation of dukkha. Things are just, so things are just happening the way they are. Doesn't mean you don't work to change the way things are happening, but they're going the way they are going right now. And if you resist that, or if you assume or insist it could or should be different, then you're going to suffer.
If you resist the way things are, you will suffer. Could you expand on that? Is that possible if you expand on that?
Yes. So, whatever is happening right now may not be pleasant. In fact, it may be unpleasant. In one way the Buddhist tradition talks about it is in terms of first darts. I mean, things don't feel good. I mean, certain sensations arise. Obvious example, if you hit your hand with a hammer, it's going to hurt. And that's what's happening now. You may wish you didn't do it, but you did it. However, do you have to go on to what is often called a second dart, where you start to moan about it, what you might say mental anguish? Do you really need to go there? Or do you go put some ice on it and just live with those first darts? So it's not that life is always pleasant, even though that's what we want. And if you can accept that life isn't always pleasant, although obviously sometimes it is, if you can accept that, then those second darts of anguish, of what you might call mental suffering, those don't arise.
Okay. I feel there's a, excuse me, a deeper level to this here, and I'd like to explore that with you.
Sure.
The first dart, second dart description, and the description of experience being pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant. So I'm not sure how to ask you about this, but pleasant, neutral, unpleasant seem like mental categorizations. So you have the raw experience. I mean, the raw sensory experience, without being categorized into pleasant, unpleasant, etc. The mental categorization seems like a step towards creating dukkha in some way.
Right. Eventually, that threefold division of, well, is this pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, that falls away as well. Okay. And there's just an acceptance of, yes, that's happening.
That's happening. Okay. With no mental anguish.
Right.
Okay. So someone who is in physical pain, like someone comes to you and says, hey, I've got a terrible pain in my shoulder. And what would you say to that person? Because you know that in reality, the pain that is there is actually not a characteristic of reality. That this person is somehow generating this experience they're calling pain and talking to you about it. So what do you say to a person like that?
Well, I would affirm that they are, in fact, in pain. For example, I had foot surgery about 8 weeks ago. It hurt, especially the first few days. I wasn't, in anguish over it, but it did hurt.
Okay.
And I wouldn't deny that people are in pain. And if people are in pain, to to tell them anything remotely like, oh, it's just in your head, it's just an interpretation, I don't think is of any help at all.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it depends on where the person's at really in terms of their understanding and insight.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes about pain comes from a nursing journal I read about 25 years ago. And it said the definition of pain is what a person says it is and occurs when a person says it occurs. And I found that definition to be very useful over the years. Okay, let's move on to insubstantiality, the third of the lakshanas. Oh, was it insubstantiality? Yeah,
Yeah.
insubstantiality. Could you share a little bit about why that survives as a description into
Right.
Satyadhana?
So if you've conditioned your experience, if you look for substance, that things are what they are because they have a certain essence to them or whatever. Initially, that's a good reminder that, well, no, they actually don't. For example, I used a coffee cup in the last interview. If I drop that coffee cup on the floor, you'll quickly agree that there was no coffee cup there ultimately because it's just a bunch of shards of ceramic on the floor. So it's a very helpful reminder from the get-go that what you're looking at doesn't have the substance to it that you might think it does. Eventually, though, once you have deconditioned your experience, you can still recognize a coffee cup when you see it. However, you're no longer projecting or trying to assume that there is any substance to it. You're just accepting that basically what you've got to work with is an image that you don't have to assume has any substance to it. So anatta, or insubstantiality, goes from being a reminder to, if you think about it, just the way things are, or the way you're actually experiencing them. You don't have to remind yourself any longer that what you're looking at has no substance because you're not assuming that it does.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for explaining that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to the main topic for this evening's interview, and that is the core of the article, Pratītya-Samutpāda. So what I'd like you to do is to give us a bird's eye perspective on what is Pratītya-Samutpāda, and I'd like you also to contrast that with something that's called Upanisa. So that's quite a lot in that question. So let's kick it off there, yeah.
Sure, and it's an entire section of the article. So what I sought to do in the article was to differentiate between what I called everyday causality. At the conventional level, things do rise and fall based on conditions. I mean, how else can you make dinner if you don't have some sense of that? I contrasted that with Pratītya-Samutpāda, or conditioned co-production as it's sometimes translated, or dependent co-origination, as the version of what you're perceiving that you see through the lens of ignorance or through the lens of greed, hatred, and delusion. So they're two different things. One of which, of course, you'll always be able to recognize. The Buddha was, I believe, I wasn't there, of course, but I believe he was able to recognize, how things worked on a daily basis. If he chewed his food, he could swallow it, and so forth. But his experience of that was no longer conditioned by ignorance. Pratītya-Samutpāda had ceased. Therefore, if the food didn't taste as he might want, there was no suffering involved. So it's differentiating between what we see in a conventional everyday sense, which in the Pali Canon is represented by terms such as Upanisa or Pratītya or Nisaya. Differentiating that from the world we create for ourselves based on ignorance.
Okay, there's quite a lot in there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's focus on Pratītya-Samutpāda for a little while. And I'm going to reference Sangharatshita here,
Mm-hmm.
and his definition of it, or his understanding of it as far as I understand it, and how that contrasts to your understanding. And I'd ask you, why is your understanding and Sangharatshita's understanding, why is it important to know that difference? Like, well, what difference does it make? Oh,
Right. Well, as I understand Sangharakshita's perspective on Pratītya-Samutpāda, it encompasses all modes of conditionality, in that it applies to everything you see that rises and falls based on conditions, and assumes that you will always see things in those terms as the way things really are. You'll always see things as impermanent, for example, or you'll always see things as having the potential to lead to suffering. That, to my mind, is much different than taking the perspective that eventually you won't see things as non-permanent or impermanent. You won't see things as potentially leading to suffering. You'll no longer assume or believe that rise and fall based on causes and conditions is the way things are. Instead, it'll be recognized as a mental interpretation that you either do or don't use in a given situation. So if you assume that Pratītya-Samutpāda applies to everything, and that you'll always see things as impermanent, then you'll never let go of that sense of rise and fall as the way things really are. Everything will still be and always be conditioned. You won't be able to see through, most likely, the illusions of time and space, because you need those to keep the belief going that the way you see things in terms of causes and conditions is actually the way things are. So it's differentiating everyday causality and ignorant causality, which assumes that things are permanent, but they seem impermanent. Things should be going my way, but they don't. So it's a different perspective on what it is we're trying to see, and what we believe things will appear as once we've properly seen them.
Okay, thanks for that explanation. Is it okay if I share my understanding of what you've written in terms of Pratītya-Samutpāda?
Yes.
And then you can tell me if I picked you up correctly or not, and if not, let's have a conversation about that. So my understanding of what you wrote was that Pratītya-Samutpāda is not a general description of reality.
Yeah, not a universal principle.
It's not a universal description. It's a very specific uh, set of conditions. So it's not, but it's not a universal. So that's the first thing that I got. Pratītya-Samutpāda isn't, it describes a particular, I'm not even going to call it a sequence, but a particular set of conditions. So it is a set, we're still talking about sets of conditions here. So there's a set of conditions called Pratītya-Samutpāda, and this particular and specific set of conditions, if they're present, inevitably dukkha will arise.
Right.
So the task is to understand these specific conditions, because if you're interested in the cessation of suffering, these are the conditions that you really want to get interested. This is the roots of your pain, everything.
Right.
So that's Pratītya-Samutpāda. Is that correct? That's specific. This is how pain arises, guys.
Right. It's in terms of a well-known phrase, this being that becomes, it's this particular thing we're focusing on. In most cases, ignorance.
Yeah.
Not everything that you can possibly see. It's focusing on, well, why do you suffer?
Okay. Yeah. So Upanisa is the more you drop a coffee cup, it smashes. You want to make an egg, you have to get all the ingredients. There's still conditions that have to be in place in order for other conditions to arise. And that's just like the universal one. Things arise upon conditions.
Right.
Okay, so
and I would say that the illustrations that I used of Upanisa can be very positive. If you follow the precepts, your mind will be calmer. You'll be able to meditate. You'll be able to start to see the way things really are. So it's not just dropping of coffee cups. It applies to virtually anything you can think of, where, at least at the conventional level, one thing generally leads to another. Doesn't mean it will, but it's just a way to describe, again, at the conventional level, what seems to be happening.
Absolutely. So it's like scientific. It's like science is based on that. You put these two chemicals together, you get a reaction. You put these two little pieces of wire, and iPhones are based on that type of thinking. Lots of brilliant medicine is. So it's like, of course, things arise in dependence upon conditions. What are the conditions for us to build an iPhone?
Right.
Okay, so that's Upanisa. So there's a couple of characteristics which I'm interested in, like that differentiate the two of them. So one is Pratītya-Samutpāda is specific. Upanisa is a broad, generally you can see it universally. So you said that Upanisa is not necessarily a reversible process, whereas Pratītya-Samutpāda describes something that will absolutely predictably happen, and it's also reversible. So it's actually, I'm making two things, I'm putting out two things in there. One is that Upanisa type of conditionality will not inevitably lead to something, whereas the Pratītya-Samutpāda, if certain conditions are in place, inevitably suffering will arise.
Right.
So can you talk about the inevitability thing, please?
Right. And I would not just limit it to Upanisa. I wrote in terms of everyday causality, of which Upanisa is an example. But for example, so everyday causality, we can say that, for example, if you follow the precepts, your mind will calm down and you can get into the dhyanas.
But not necessarily.
But not necessarily, as many people know.
Yeah.
So while you read in the Pali Canon that there is this progression that leads to dhyana, we can say it might, but it might not.
Okay.
And similarly, the result of everyday causality may not be reversible. For example, if you mix things
Can
together.
can I slow you
Oh,
down?
sure.
Please, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So before we go into the irreversible, reversible
Mm-hmm.
comparison, Sangharatshita came to mind there again,
Mm-hmm.
and the conditions that he recommended people create for themselves in order for a spiritual life to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, spiritual progress to be made.
Right.
So I just want to acknowledge that the conditions that he set up are just so fantastic, you know, not not guaranteed results,
Right.
but the general field that has been created is certainly increases the likelihood, perhaps.
Yes, definitely.
Mm. So with Upanisa, we're talking about likelihoods, really. You know, we're talking about statistical possibility.
Well, I wouldn't limit it to that, but
Yeah,
that's
okay.
one way to describe it, is that you put these in conditions in place for many people that will, you will get those results.
Yeah, okay. And for some, it ain't enough. Or
Yeah, I
some,
mean, the same conditions aren't right for everyone. One of the topics that's currently being discussed within Triratna is lifestyle, and in particular families. Some people will say that not living in a family situation is the most conducive to spiritual progress. Others would disagree. So it may be helpful or it may be not.
okay, it may be helpful or it may be not. So that's all Upanisa stuff.
Or possible causality on an everyday level that you can point to, go and say, yeah, that can lead to that.
Yeah, probably should do, you know. Well, not should do, but, you know, there's a chance. Okay, so Pratītya-Samutpāda, though, is something quite different. Tell us about that. So, because that's quite different in terms of like there's an inevitability if these conditions are in place, suffering will arise. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So
So
what conditions have to be in place?
right. So one of in fact, the main illustration of Pratītya-Samutpāda is the 12 cyclic nidanas. It starts with, if ignorance is in place as a condition, sankhara or samskaras will arise. And it's probably going to be largely unconscious, and that's what's going to happen. If you are ignorant, if you're ignoring the way things really are and trying to make up your own version that's permanent and pleasing and substantial, you're going to develop some scars that will lead to suffering. That's one way to phrase it. When the Buddha taught about the Dhamma Niyama, or the Dhamma Niyamata, he talked about that. He talked about it in that sense of inevitability. He said, whether or not Buddha arises to tell you this is what's going to happen if you're ignorant. You're going to go to some samskaras, and the 12 cyclic nidanas will be the result. The good thing is, of course, is that with mindfulness and insight, you can start to peel away that condition to co-production. But if you don't look closely, that'll be your experience of life.
Yeah, okay. Let's talk about ignorance for a while. So that connects in with the lakshanas. That's one way of framing it. So what, we're revisiting something here, but just for the sake of completeness perhaps, how would you describe ignorance in terms of the three lakshanas? Like, so that's the core, and dependence upon this, suffering will never be erased.
So avidya, one way to translate it, is not knowing or being ignorant. In terms of something you do, I think it can be helpful to talk in terms of ignoring what it is you see and instead try to make up your own version of it. So instead of just dealing with or just seeing what is in the scene, it's like we're wired, we have these underlying tendencies to look for a different version or create a different version in our mind that is somehow, for example, permanent, predictable, sustainable. We ignore the fact that that isn't possible. So what happens is that we look for permanence and sustainability and predictability and so forth, don't find it, and so what we see appears to us as impermanent or not permanent. So it's because we're ignorant, because we're ignoring the way things really are. We need these reminders say, hey, you're you're looking for something that just isn't there.
Like the Lakshana.
Yeah, so the Lakshanas, that's one way of seeing them as reminders. You're looking for permanence, it's not there. You're looking for things to go your way, it's not going to happen. You're looking for things to be substantial, it's not there.
Okay, and suffering will inevitably be a consequence of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that is the inevitability aspect. The other quality or aspect that I'm interested in is the whole reversibility aspect. So Upanisa is not reversible. So,
well, I wouldn't say it isn't, but it can be irreversible. For example, if you bake a cake, you mix up the ingredients, put it in your oven. Good luck reverting that cake back to its ingredients.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So
it's not okay. So would you say it's like sometimes I can't actually see how anything conditioned could be reversible? Like, how could you reverse anything that's conditioned? Like, how do you get, if that cake thing or whatever you end up cooking,
Well, I have
any examples of things.
Well, I have a degree in chemistry. I know that you can mix two chemicals together, get a new chemical, and then you can split them apart and get what you started with.
Oh, yeah. But would you really get what you started with?
Well, not the exact same crystal structure necessarily, but
no, it'd be subtly different, So anyhow, so the point is, it's not always guaranteed to be reversible.
Right.
Okay.
But in the case of Pratītya-Samutpāda, it is reversible, and then that causal sequence can cease. It can stop. One thing leading to another of those 12 particular things.
So it's reversible. That's so, like, it's reliably reversible?
Right. If it wasn't, there wouldn't be much point in being a Buddhist, really.
Okay.
If, for example, the one causal juncture, if you will, which is often called the gap, is between sensations that arise and the craving that can arise as a result of that. But if you break that causal link, then that craving doesn't have to arise any longer. So you can talk about it in terms of being reversible or ceasable.
Okay. Oh, so that's very hopeful, because you come across these sorts of teachings and you hear, oh my God, I can actually remove the causes of suffering in my life. Yeah. And it's completely mapped out, and it'll work.
Yeah, and there's many ways to go about it, but I think that's one of the distinctive features of the Dharma, of what we call Buddhism, is that there is that affirmative statement that the dukkha can cease.
Yeah. Okay. And so the focus, if you're practicing in this sort of context that we're talking about, is not whether or not you're living in a family, whether or not you're living in working in a co-op, whether or not you're meditating 20 hours a day. The point is, are you working on the conditions for suffering, the arising suffering in your life, and doing what you can to reverse change the conditions, or reverse the whole process so that suffering does not arise? Can you do that in a family situation?
Absolutely.
I think so. In fact, it's suffering is, things are, like I've got a 2.5-year-old baby, and I mean, I've shifted from trying to organize my life to one of, I call it chaos planning. And chaos planning means that if something is going to go wrong, it will go wrong, and it'll go wrong all the time. So I plan my life around that.
Right. And that's not to say that, living in a community and working at a co-op won't be a positive and helpful situation. But for some, it may not be. And in fact, it may be that having a family and dealing with those challenges, the plan to chaos, is the best, or maybe not the best, but is a more helpful set of conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and so the point is working with the roots of dukkha. If you're interested in cessation of dukkha. All right, so let me ask you a couple more questions and we'll wind up. What advice would you give to someone who's got this distinction, the distinction between Upanisa and Pratītya-Samutpāda, and they want to begin in earnest their journey to dismantle the roots of suffering in their life? So I'm not talking about a beginner here. I'm talking about an experienced practitioner who knows they're suffering, has been doing the Upanisa thing, hasn't really completely worked, they know it. What advice would you give? Like, what first step would you say, hey, look, what would you say to them?
Well, the first thing I would say is the perception of what we might call everyday causality doesn't cease. Things are not going to wink out. There's, if someone has a fair bit of practice behind them, they may be able to, easily avoid, a nihilistic outcome. Or they may not be so concerned about that. But the first thing I would affirm is that, this isn't about nihilism. Things aren't the way you think they are, but that doesn't mean that they aren't at all. So that everyday sense of causality, whether you describe it by Upanisa, Pratītya, Nisaya, and so forth, that's always going to continue, and you don't have to worry about that. The other type of causality that we can explore, and that the good news is it can cease, is what's described by Pratītya-Samutpāda. This ignorance being all that eventually suffering becomes. And the reason it arises is because we have a certain set of expectations or conditions or assumptions that we have about life. The first assumption is that we are or have a self that is permanent or impermanent or empirical or whatever you want to call it. The sense of agency, of being in charge of our lives, of having all that experience. That's one of our fundamental assumptions that results from ignoring the way things really are. So understanding Pratītya-Samutpāda, one way to describe that is understanding how and why you created the belief in a self and working toward letting go of that. All your memories will stay intact. You can still drive a car. You can still plan for chaos. All that persists. The only thing that goes away is the belief that there's somebody in charge of all that, that's having and doing that experience.
Okay, that'll be the first step.
Right.
The first step. Okay. Okay, fantastic. So, I mean, a few years ago, I'd have thought, oh my God, that's the first step. That sounds like the end of the path, but it's actually not the end of the path to see clearly, to experience clearly that there is no agency, self,
Ego,
self,
whatever,
whatever way you described it there. So that's the first step. Okay. And I suppose we dare not mention the 10 fetters. But that is the first step of...
right. And even if you're not into the fetters formulation, for example, within Triratna, what's sometimes called reducing self-clinging or seeing through the illusion of yourself, that's nevertheless that first big step. So it doesn't matter whether you like the fetters formulation or not. This idea that there's a self of some sort is the first thing that's got to go, if you will.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about the first thing. It just seems, just to repeat myself, it just seems like such a huge thing, but it's actually not. It's just
right. And that's not to say that you don't have to set some conditions in place. Yeah. But as you say, if I understand what you're saying, it's not necessarily as big an undertaking as it's sometimes made out to be either.
Yeah. Okay, let's wind up now. Satyadhana, do you have any final thoughts or words before we finish? On Pratītya-Samutpāda and Upanisa.
I would say that one of the reasons I wrote the article is that I got to the point where I no longer saw conditionality. It no longer made any sense, or it no longer seemed to explain anything. And I went back and reread canonical literature again. And from that perspective, it made a lot more sense that the Buddha said that all conditioned things are impermanent. He didn't say all things were impermanent, for example. And so the intention in writing the article wasn't to dismiss what Sangharatshita has said, but it is to provide a different perspective. And the intent in writing it was to help people no longer suffer. So that was the intent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It certainly has helped me. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Did I interrupt you there? Were you going to say something else?
No, I think that's it.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much, Satyadhana. This is the second interview of... We have planned 3, but it feels that there might be a 4th in there. I'm not sure.
It's feeling like it, yeah.
Yeah. So we have not decided what we'll talk about next week. I have it in my notes somewhere. The next time we speak. So anyhow, thanks again.
Thank you. Yeah, good night.